It's a really great pleasure to be here. Three reasons. One is because I've seen some of the other speakers you had, and some of them are my friends, and you've chosen well. Dominic, I heard, was here before. I promise not to be as foul-mouthed as he is. Bless him, he's got great way with words. The second reason is this afternoon I went for a meal with somebody, and I said, "Oh, this evening I'm going to go to the Young Leaders Conference." And this friend, who obviously, was flattering me ridiculously, said, "Oh, are you going to speak to the young leaders, or to be one of the young leaders?" And it's been a very long time since I've been called either young, and I don't think I've ever been called a leader. So that was very nice. But the third reason is that I think your gathering of young, hopefully opinion formers in Britain and China is very significant, because I've lived here 8 years, so China's really my home. Obviously I'm from Britain, I'm from London. So these are the two countries that weigh very heavily in my life, in a nice way. And what I've come to realise, particularly in writing this book and taking this job as environment correspondent, is that there's a real possibility that Britain and China are bookends. We are bookends on a period of economic growth and development, the likes of which the world has never seen before, 200 years or more since the Industrial Revolution to now. And I fear it's a real risk we won't see that again, that this is not normal. This 250 years may well be an aberration. And so we can learn both from how all of this started, and now, as we all search for something new and different to take us forward in China, you have a great deal to share and to learn from each other in this regard. And there will be business opportunities, there will be political dialogue necessities, all of these things that you've already started here at this level. So I think that's immensely important, because I think what I've seen here, and I should first tell you where I come from. I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool greenie. I wasn't climbing trees with Swampy 15 years ago. I came into journalism through my experience in Japan. I was I did financial news, business news, technology news, social news. And actually, while I was in Japan, I didn't write that many stories about the environment, even though I was with The Guardian, which is a fairly green newspaper. But when I came to Japan, when I came to China in 2003, not deliberately, I just found I was writing so many stories about the environment. And I came to realize it's shaping so much of what's going on. And it's one of the major obstacles both to future economic development and also to social stability and international security. It's a fantastically important subject which I'd not fully taken account of before. So I think, in a sense, what I want to say to you is like congratulations and commiserations. Congratulations, because we are all here at this, what I think might well be a really remarkable time for the human race. The thousands, tens of thousands of years of sort of civilization, the millions of years of humanity or forms of humanity, we have never been so successful. There's never been more of us. We've never lived longer. We've never consumed more energy. I mean, all of us in this room, probably in a year, travel more than Marco Polo did in his whole lifetime. We all consume like the kings of old on a very regular basis. And our energy levels that we consume in terms of kilowatts and calories is like nothing that's ever been seen before. But by one account, on the global average, not just people in this room, who of course we're very privileged, but global average, according to one environmental historian, is the equivalent of 20 slaves worth of energy every year. I'm not sure how you calculate a slave's worth of energy, but I think you get the rough idea. So we're at this absolutely exceptional time for humanity, and that's the really good news. But the bad news is you can have too much of a good thing, and there's a real danger that we will become like locusts. You know, we're just consuming too much of everything, or that we'll become like a virus that is in danger of threatening its host. So we need to find a new balance very clearly. I don't think there's any dispute about that. And quite how we do it is, of course, the big question. And I think the reasons for believing that, and also the hope that we can find something new in China, both come from my 8 years in this country. And I'll talk about those a little bit now in the course of describing my book. That should take quite a chunk of time, but I also want to leave a bit of time at the end to consider some new ways of thinking above and beyond what China and the West is doing. It's more a collection of ideas that I've come across in the course of travelling around. And you know, as I said, I don't claim to be a devotee, and up to a point I cannot say I'm an expert compared to a lot of the people I meet, but almost by accident I guess I have a fairly special set of experiences. I don't think there are many people, certainly not in the English-speaking world, who've had the opportunity to travel around this country at this very, very remarkable time. So I've tried to put this in my book, When a Billion Chinese Jump, which I should maybe very briefly explain the title. It dates back to my first childhood encounter with the idea of apocalypse. I don't know if you can cast your mind back to that horrible point when you're probably a little kid growing up, soon after you realise about mortality, and then somebody tries to go a step further, not just your death, but everything disappearing. Not a very nice thought. And in my case, it was an adult, and I was trying to understand the scale of China. And growing up in North London, in a suburb, it just was too big for me. So an adult said, put it this way: if everyone in China jumped at the same time, the world would be jolted off its axis and go spinning off into space, and we'd all die. But don't worry, that'll never happen. Now, you can't say that to a little kid, especially someone like me who was a born worrier. And now, by the way, I'm a professional worrier. That's what journalists do. So, even though he said it wouldn't happen, for a while then I was brought up a good Christian, and every night before I went to bed I would, please look after mummy and daddy and my sister and my dog and world peace, etc., etc. At the end, and please don't let everyone in China jump at the same time. Now that's ridiculous, of course. It's a childish fear, but I've chosen this as a title for two reasons. One is because I think it shows that sometimes the fears of China are irrational. We have this Orientalist view of the other, of that very big, unknowable place on the other side of the world. And so we do have these crazy fears. But also there is a very real reason to be concerned about what's happening here. And that's not that China's becoming more mysterious and Oriental and other, it's that China's becoming more like us. And we're the problem. We are the problem in terms of our consumption levels. That is the biggest problem that the world faces right now, I believe. And the multiplier effect in China really can change all sorts of different balances. So it's quite a serious message, but I've tried to make it a more entertaining, more accessible read in a number of ways. The first is it's a travelogue. So it's a travelogue through pretty much every province. I think I missed a couple. Over close to 100,000 kilometers, and it starts here. Basically Shangri-La, or close to Shangri-La. This is actually Zhoujiagou in Sichuan province. But I wanted to start here to show that China's not just smokestacks and big factories and super cities. China also has amazing bio-wealth. There are more species in Sichuan province than all of North America. So it's got a lot to lose, that often gets forgotten. But I go from here, this mega biodiversity, this beautiful place, this paradise, and I finish the book here. Not an awful lot of biodiversity, as you can see there, that is the horizon in Inner Mongolia on the Gobi Desert. And what I'm trying to show is that humanity is moving in this direction. We're moving further and further away from the former and closer to using up the resources. Clearly, we are still quite comfortably in the middle compared to this. But the direction, I don't think anybody would argue with at present. So I also tried to make the book a little bit more accessible with some of the very interesting and bizarre elements of the environment and the problems. In particular, for example, very irresponsible practices. This guy is fishing with electricity. In each hand he has a pole, one positive, one negative, battery on his back, everything in between dies. Instant fishing. Not too bad if it's one guy trying to get fish for one restaurant. Trouble is, there are also big ships that do that in some places, including the Yangtze, and that's why things like the Yangtze river dolphin, the Baiji, are probably extinct, certainly functionally extinct, might be one or two left, but they haven't been seen for years. So that's one side of it. Another side was just to show that the communication problems between what is the environment, what does it mean, and there are very big definition differences. And when I first came here and I started to ask people about the environment, they would say, oh, yes, we have a great environment. Our streets are cleaned of rubbish every day. Even though the air was bad and the water was bad, the environment was much more localized. And these kind of communication problems, or fun, they can be fun in lots of other things, such as, ridiculous level here, but your Chinese restaurant menu, this is, of course, mouth-watering chicken. It comes out of saliva chicken, not quite so clear. And then the other way you try to make an environment book more accessible, of course, is to have lots of cute and cuddly animals, none more so than the panda, and also to have, if you really want to attract people, to have a more, some sex in your book as well, and to get both together, panda sex. Obviously, you put the two together. And so there's more detail about panda breeding than I can't go to a zoo and look at a panda anymore. No, I know way too much about panda breeding habits. But essentially, the message of the book is much more serious. I start in the southwest. I do an inventory of what China has to lose: the forests, the rivers, the lakes, the mountains, the air. Then I look at the processes of change, human change, urbanization, industrialization, consumer culture, globalization. The third part of the book looks at how this is leading to imbalances, so climate change, pollution, in particular coal-related pollution, and various diseases that arise as a result of environmental degradation. And the last part of the book looks at solutions. What are the alternatives? What are the new technologies we can use? What are the new ways of thinking that we can seek to spread that can help with the situation we're in? What is the government doing? What can other governments do? What can people do at the grassroots? And there, I think, there is an imbalance. I would emphasize this, and I think the imbalance is between the two different sides of the problem. When you're talking about the environment, there's the in problems, there's the sort of the consumer problems, what we take, and there's the out problems, the waste, and so on. And so, we are obviously running down a lot of resources: timber, coal, and water. And at the same time, we're building up the out problems, the waste, the emissions, and the toxins. And I think in China there has been, and in the world indeed, there's been a tendency to think of environmental problems too exclusively as out problems, as pollution. I mean, that is an environmental problem, and that's something that everyone is focused on and should be focused on. But that top level, that's the real origin of things, the consumption level. And I think that's where there still needs to be a lot of work in China and also in the outside world. And I was talking to some people earlier who are involved in preparing for Rio+20 conference next year. And I certainly hope that that's a place where consumption can be put higher on the agenda. Now, the focus, as I said, has tended to be China has an environmental problem because of pollution, and that's very true. Unfortunately, the colour's not great on this, but you get to see some amazing coloured water as you go around the countryside. This is actually red. The colour's a bit faded on here, but this is from a paper mill. And here, this is very thick pollution in Gansu. And the skies in particular are, you know, it's often said what colour is it moving water? Sorry, don't freeze on me. Oh, I think it has frozen on me. That's not good. No, that's good. Sorry. It's often said what colour is China? There's, of course, the red communist China that we should fear, or as Tom Friedman and others in the New York Times often talk about, green China. And in America, green China is being seen as a threat, because green China is investing more in the energy of the future, in solar and wind. And there's a fear in America that they're being overtaken. But I think the fears of red China are outdated. The hopes for a green China are still somewhat premature. And on the whole, for the last 8 years, while I've been here, I would say the colour of China more than any is grey. It's grey China, it's skies like this. This is in Chongqing. This is in Henan. This is in Beijing. We've had a lovely week. I think you were here. Were you here last week? Yeah, apparently early last week it was awful. I wasn't here. And I think it's maybe getting slightly better. But anyway, I took this picture in Beijing last December. But I think that the air pollution problem, the water pollution problem, it's huge. I think they will be solved. And I think things will improve a great deal in the next 5 to 10 years. The government set some very good targets in its latest 5-year plan. And you can fix it. This is exactly the same view. And so clearly, it depends a lot on atmospheric conditions, on weather patterns, on traffic conditions, and so on. Now, hopefully at this point, a lot of you are thinking, well, so what if China has some pollution? You know, every country's gone through its dirty, polluting phase of development. Charles Dickens in Victorian Britain talked about smoke billowing out of the chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle. And he talked about the death of the sun. It was so bad in London at that time, and you can clean up. And the same things happened in the US, the same things happened in Japan, which I know very well, and there's a model for it. This is the model. It's essentially the same as the economic Kuznets curve that any economists among you will know, but it's an environmental equivalent. And essentially, a country starts development here, and they're very poor and very clean. And then in their early phase of development, it's very rapid and very dirty. You're using a lot of coal, you're cutting down a lot of trees, you haven't really thought about how you're going to deal with all that extra waste. And then you reach a point of average incomes, depends on the country, but usually around $5,000 to $8,000 per person, where people start to think, well, I don't want to live in a pigsty. I have the money to clear up. And you start to see a change. You grow, but you grow clean. Now this is sort of classic developmental curve, and it's hoped that China will follow the same pattern. So I certainly hope so. Some people already think China might even be able to take a shortcut because it can learn from other countries. And the environment minister, when I asked him, where are you on this curve, he said we're already over the top. Maybe a bit ambitious, but certainly I would say you will see an improvement, at least in the big cities, the rich cities of the West, in the next 5 to 10 years on that point. But what I want to say is, this isn't the whole story. This again just emphasizes all the out stuff, all the pollution and emissions and waste. And we can't forget the other side of the story, and we too often do. One of the reasons is that you have to think how countries clean up. Now, there's basically two ways. One way reflects very well on us as human beings. which is that we become smarter, we invest more in technology and recycling, and we clear up our problems that way. But the other way we clear up, and we tend not to talk about this so much because it reflects not very well on us, is that we dump our problems on someone else. And this is effectively what we call euphemistically outsourcing. And for at least 200 years we've been at various stages outsourcing both to other countries coming up the value chain, but also to future generations. We're expecting other people to deal with our problems. We are not taking full responsibility for what we do. Now, I think that model basically started in the UK and has expanded wider and wider and wider, and now pretty much the whole developed world is responsible, as I'll show you shortly. And it leads to things like this guy. This is the city of Guiyu in the south of China, in Guangzhou province. And this is the e-waste recycling center. It's an amazing place. The whole street is full of little guys like this with very basic equipment, recycling hard drives, projectors, cameras, mobile phones, which in one sense it's good, but in another way it's being done cheaply. So these people are being exposed to various toxins, brominated fire retardants, lead, all sorts of nasty stuff in these materials. And so there is a very real health risk. Now, I think lots of countries have done this in the past, as I've said. You get rich, you move up the value chain, you pass on the lower end stuff to the next countries that are emerging. And it was a fairly natural progress. It started, say, 250 years ago, 200 years ago in the UK. One fairly small country in the world, polluting the skies above Manchester and Stoke and those big, industrial centres, but not really making a huge impact on the world. And then sucking resources from India and other colonies, but still one small country sucking them up, most of the world to suck from. And this model expanded to Europe, and then it grew, and then it grew, and then it grew, and then finally you reach the point where, where we are now, I hope this will hold that screen, where almost more than half the world certainly is already doing the same thing. So there's more and more people pushing out smoke, more and more people consuming resources, and less of the world to supply the materials and to absorb the waste. That means, of course, there's a price impact. The value of commodities goes up, the cost of dealing with waste goes down, and that's pretty much where we are right now. And when I said to you earlier, I think we're at this, this amazing peak. It really is, I think, a peak of consumption. It's as if the jaws of humanity are getting wider and wider, and here I've tried to show how wide the jaws have become. The top, the grey bit, is the size of the human population, which has, in pre-industrial times, fluctuated, certainly within this line, but never got that huge until you hit the Industrial Revolution, and then in, I think it was 1750, the whole population of the world was half that of China today. So you've seen this amazing rise since. And then how much energy, kilowatts and calories we use per person, again, it would have fluctuated. Here there was some use of coal, there was some use of timber, but it was only really when you started to get machines to use coal on a large scale that you suddenly have this surge. So there's more and more of us basically using a lot of material. So what? Well, I think this is important when you consider China's position, because China would like to follow the old development model. Well, I think we're at the point where this model is breaking or broken, and so we're really all together trying to find something new. And the reason is, I think, as I tried to show in those previous graphs, that when Britain started this whole thing off, there was a huge development space for a fairly small country. Whereas today, there's very little development space for the big country that's China. It's as if the world's been feasted, there's been this big feast available, and Britain was the first one to go along and start eating. More and more countries joined, and now China, the biggest country with the biggest appetite, is arriving when the food half the food has disappeared. It's very, very difficult to keep everybody satisfied in those sorts of situations. So I think what you're seeing in China at the moment is they are trying to do some of the same things. They are investing more in resources, in particular in Africa, in South America, Mongolia, pretty much the whole world at the moment. It's not enough, I think, when you get to the China scale to follow what happened before. China is different from the other development models for 3 reasons. 2 of them are widely known: scale and speed. The 3rd one is not said often enough, which is the timing, which I've tried to show you. This particular time in human history, this particular time in the economic development line, if you like. So I think it's having to look for something else, but one of the things it's doing is it's eating itself a little bit. It's passing on, it's doing development within China like the world's done it until now. So the countries, the provinces that are the most advanced in terms of development, that's Shandong, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Fujian, Guangdong, all the coastal places that can trade. These provinces are now actually getting quite rich, and they're certainly, most of them are probably over that development curve. So they've started trying to clean up. I was just last week in Huaxi, which claims to be the #1 village in China, and it says it's closing down its steel plant in 5 years and wants to build Shangri-La. Not easy to build Shangri-La in the Jiangsu countryside, I can tell you, but that's what they need to do. But what they're doing as they clean up is, just like the rich countries have done in the past, they're pushing their dirtier industry to other areas. And so you're seeing more and more dirty industry here around Ningxia, Inner Mongolia. You're seeing more resource extraction and resource use in Inner Mongolia, in Xinjiang, in Tibet. Tibet, one of the last great dam rivers in Asia, maybe in the world, the Yangtze, known as the Brahmaputra in India. Big trend, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years, massive hydropower development here. Xinjiang, further from the sea than anywhere else on Earth. And for that reason, considered very difficult to develop. But it has China's biggest coal deposits, about 40%. They haven't been tapped until now because it costs so much to send them to where most of the factories still are. So they're going to send some of the factories here, but they're also going to start gasifying the coal. And then they can pipe it, or liquefying the coal, which is another whole problem because a lot of it will end up in car engines. So that's a trend there. Inner Mongolia is the center of rare earth production in China. So this is, the Gobi Desert used to be a very remote place, but increasingly it's not. So I sort of come to this conclusion gradually, in that I've been really lucky in these 8 years. I've been able to go to all the places I grew up thinking as a child, this is adventure, this is remoteness, this is far away from anywhere. Tibet, highest place on earth. Xinjiang, the deserts, the Gobi Desert. And yet, then none of them are remote anymore. There is a road to everywhere. And it's because they're all being developed. Now, of course, this is wonderful for the people. It's raising living standards. There's definitely a very positive side, creating business opportunities. But viewed from an environmental prism, you're seeing now a lot of the problems. This is on the Tibetan plateau, huge wastelands, and serious water shortages in large parts of, in Yunnan even. Yunnan used to be one of the most humid and water abundant provinces of China. This is a lake, by the way. This is a lake that never dried up before, but last year I was there in Yunnan, this lake had dried up. And just a couple of stories that illustrate some of the problems. This lady, her name is Namuhua, she's a Mongolian. And Mongolians are traditionally herders, and they're nomadic herders. But 15, 20 years ago, she wanted to join China's economic revolution. So she and some other herders got together, settled, and invested in a tourist resort by a lake. And they had sort of concrete tents, they had pony rides, they had boat trips on the lake and fishing. But within 5 years, this had happened to their lake. Totally dried up. And this building you see here, this is the ticket office for the ferry boats. And that line you can see, that's the pier out into what was a lake. So of course, this illustrates really strongly that the environment has an economic impact and a social impact because they've lost their money. Because they've lost their money, many of them are having to move into the cities, and it's one of the drivers of migration is ecological damage in certain parts of China. Another problem is pollution, well known, shortage of water, but also quality of water. And if water is China's biggest problem, more than anything else. When you pollute your river systems too much, the water systems cannot flush it through, and then it goes into the livestock around, it goes into the crops around, and then it goes into the human bodies, of course. And so you reach that limit also of human tolerance for what's going on. This lady, she's in a place from a place called Shanglong in the south of Yunnan. And you could maybe able to just make out she's losing her hair because she's undergoing chemotherapy, and that's because she's contracted cancer, like so many people in her village in the last 10 years, and they believe they are from a so-called cancer village, and there's said to be 100 to 400 of these cancer villages. And of course, when you hit the levels of human tolerance, you also hit the level of patience and social tolerance. And as a result, China has had a lot of protests related to the environment in the last 10 years. This is a particularly bad one, where 1,000 riot police were beaten off by villagers with their hoes and sticks. And I went to the aftermath, and I was amazed, because sometimes being a journalist in China is not that easy, because I can't really go undercover, you can imagine, at this height. And so you go at night, and you try to get taxis that have curtains and do all these things to sort of stay undercover. And I got to this place, and I was being very furtive, and the locals just started laughing at me. They said, what are you worried about? I said, oh, there might be some police, and they see me, they'll take me away. It's happened again and again. They said, there are no police here. Police are scared to come here. And one little old lady said, come here, I'll show you. And she went to her living room, and her living room was full of trophies from the battle. She had all these police helmets and police shields and police sticks. So I mean, these things are going on. We don't really know how many, but there's been some high-profile ones recently. This was one in Beijing. There was a big one in Dalian, and the government is paying attention. The one in Dalian forced the closure of a big PX chemical factory. So there's a social tolerance that the economy or reckless economic growth is punching up against. And then, of course, there's the limit that we all face of the climatic limit of how much more we can grow in the way that we've been growing so far. And China is perhaps more aware of this than anyone, because it's very badly affected in many places by climate change, and very noticeable in glaciers like this one. This is the #1 glacier in Urumqi, and this was the first glacier China ever measured from 1959, and the reason they measured it, ironically, and I interviewed the scientist who went on that first mission, he's very old now, the reason they measured it is because they wanted to know how can we make it melt more quickly. They needed the water for irrigation, and so they tried different techniques, including taking coal dust and sprinkling it on the white surface so it became dark, and it would absorb more heat from the sun and melt more quickly. So they succeeded. But China's very, very well aware of its environmental problems. If one thing is reassuring, it's that I think China, there's not climate denial from a religious point of view, as you get particularly in the United States. There's a very scientific approach to everything. The whole country's supposed to be heading towards scientific development, and you have a prime minister who's a geologist, you have a president who is trained as a hydro engineer, so you've got Prime Minister Earth and President Water. They really know the issues at stake, And I think they're trying to do something, but they really are trying to do something from a supply-side engineered perspective. Not much on the demand side, not much on the cultural side, and that's where things are missing. But there is a lot going on. There's been an amazing growth of grassroots movements. The number of NGOs that are working on the environment has gone from one. The first one was founded in 1994, and now there are more than 2,000, including this fella, he's a Tibetan in Yunnan, and he's fighting against deforestation and doing quite a good job. This was destroyed about 15 years ago, and since then there's been a lot of reforestation. And a big positive story out of China is that China's planting more trees than the rest of the world put together at the moment. Quality of the forest is another issue, but certainly building up forest stock. Then there's a story I'm sure you would have heard this morning from Wu Chenghua of the Climate Group. Was she here? Oh, Shetifla, sorry. Well, she would have told you about this better than anyone. But China's investments in renewables, in wind, are exceptional, in solar, exceptional. It's the #1 in the world for production for both. And wind in particular is very, very visible in China. You go along the old Silk Road near the Gobi Desert, all the way to the Xinjiang, and you can get stuck in a traffic jam behind a long convoy of the towers and the blades of the wind farms that they're erecting. Solar, less so, but that's growing quite quickly, including this hotel, which claims to be largely producing its electricity from all these solar panels on the front. And then more radical scientific measures like the use of algae to absorb carbon dioxide. And China's pushing ahead with this more than I think any other country. The idea is that the algae can soak up the carbon dioxide, and then you can use that algae for biofuel, or you can use it for feeding your animals. And then those huge engineering projects. This one is the South-North Water Diversion, the world's biggest plumbing operation. It's like 3 giant road-sized water superhighways that aim to channel water from the south up to the north. It's a sign of just how ambitious China is, also a sign of how desperate they are, because this has never been done before on this scale, and it might solve the problems of the north. It could make the problems of the south better. So there's all these sorts of things going on, more than in many other countries in the world, I think, and China does deserve credit for that. But I think it goes back to that driver of consumption. China's consumption is still lower than that of the West. And as a result, China's emissions per person are generally lower than those in the West, but it's catching up. It still has this consumer dream lifestyle. It still dominates. And as a result, the most advanced cities in China are actually starting to get ahead of the biggest cities in Europe. They're not being built and designed well enough. This is an absolute core thing in the future, how to make your cities more environmentally friendly. And here, this is a graph that shows emissions per person. And what you can see is that the average emissions in Shanghai and Tianjin are now higher than the average in Germany and the UK and France. And this trend is going to increase more and more. This Shanghai ball is moving that way, towards higher and higher per capita emissions, whereas the Western ones are tending in this direction. So China has a really massive problem on its hands in dealing with this, because its cities, when peasants move into the city, they consume 3 times more than when they were in the countryside. So that's absolutely crucial. And in this sense, my feelings about China's environment changed a great deal in writing the book. When I started, I thought I would be writing primarily about pollution, poor governance, and a lack of transparency in a one-party system, and finally about climate change. All of those things are very, very important. But what I realized is that at least as important, if not more, is the loss of biodiversity, the loss, globalization of big global trends, and finally consumption. Because we're all focused on pollution as a problem, but actually most of us want more consumption from China for economic reasons. And so this will be the big challenge we face in the future. And as I said, places like this model village I went to, they're looking for a new model. China's looking for a new model, but unlike in the past, it doesn't have anything to easily follow. There isn't the simple development pattern that has happened in the past. They're trying to reinvent the model. And I think they're struggling to find the next step. And to take an extreme example, that village I mentioned, the #1 village in China, Huaxi, they have, as I said, they closed down their steel factory. They want to create this Shangri-La in the Jiangsu countryside. But as a first step, they built this. It's going to open tomorrow. You get a sneak preview. No, on Saturday. This is in a village. This building is taller than any building in Europe or Japan. And the village is trying to use it. They say, we want to move into tourism. We want to move into the tertiary sector. And 5 years ago, I visited this place when they were building these. And I saw those and I just thought, what are you doing? It's too much of a leap. But now these things, it's absolutely, they're dwarfed by this super tower. And I really hope they can become a paradise in the countryside. But I fear they're just trying to push GDP growth forward, whatever the costs. Quite magnificent, biggest banquet hall in south of China. And they're very proud that they have this gold ox, 1-ton gold ox, in the midst of it. So to sort of get back to the solutions, I think you've... It's weird. Come on. Right, so you've moved this. I think China's really following this, and it will follow this. But that only deals with the emission side of things, the outward problem, the outgoing problem, the waste problem. I think what we need next, and this is in China, but it's also in the world, is a different kind of curve, a development curve that we haven't hit yet, or at least haven't recognized yet. Oh, that's not a curve. Oh, that's very weird. Oh, it's there. It should be a different color, and it's more really focusing on consumption, and that I think China's lower down in this curve. But in this curve, as people start on the development stage, there are expectations, and what their politicians try to deliver to them is happiness through consumption. And certainly, when you start off, and maybe lots of countries, when you start development, you can't be guaranteed of a regular meal. So it's very important. You maybe don't have clothes, maybe you don't have a home over your head. So these things are massively important. But then you will get to a point where you have enough. And that's what I think we are at now, is realizing when we have enough. But many developed nations are here, I think, and they're still trying to grow. But I think there's a point where GDP growth, just for the sake of GDP growth, it starts to become unhealthy and unsustainable. It's growth that doesn't lead to becoming taller and stronger. It's growth that leads to stress and obesity and tumours and challenges and rivalry between different countries. And so if you can get here and then realise, okay, I've had enough, and then pursue a quality of growth instead of a quantity of growth, that's, I think, where we need to go now. And I will speak to, there's a big conference next week in Copenhagen where this is going to be one of the key topics as they try to discuss what is green growth. And that will be a very big topic at Rio next year, at Rio +20. And the key is, how do you get the economy and the environment in sync? Until now, the environment and environmental resources are being seen as a subset of the economy. I think what needs to be done in the future is to see the economy as a subset of the environment and the ecosystem. So we've got to really reverse this relationship, and that's going to be a huge challenge, because that's a fundamental challenge in values. But I think that's where that's the big missing link. Technology will take us a lot of the way to where we want to go. We should be investing more in technology, but we have to invest, or at least work more on values. And I think there's signs of that in China, but it's very early on. But there is this growing realization that as resources get smaller, as the population increases, in the future we have to choose between international cooperation to conserve or nationalist competition to consume. And that could be the difference between war and peace in lots of ways. But China is a place, I think, where change has to happen, because the environment crisis here is so bad, they cannot pretend and go on as business as usual and outsource their problems as other countries have done in the past. And I think that's why this is the absolute fundamental battleground, as you said in the introduction. So I'll leave it there. I'm quite happy to take questions directly or one-on-one later. But thank you very much for listening to me, and enjoy the rest of your time here.